yeah, 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 oh, 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 yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, oh, 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 yeah, yeah, yeah.
The medium, television and cinema, little by little became the most important and the most potent means of expression. So I was seeing this going on. But as a journalist, I think what started frustrating me most was suddenly I realized that we were at the mercy of whatever they wanted us to write or whatever was being told, because we had so little time. And you had to churn out a story every day. So there was, it was during the Gulf War. That was the real moment when things sort of broke for me. During the Gulf War, I realized that all these different events were happening that I had covered, but I had absolutely no clue what the bigger picture was. And I never had the time to put the pieces together. And I had a bit of identity crisis because here I was working for British and American newspapers, and the way everybody was reacting towards Iraq, it became almost a racial thing. And I wasn't quite sure where to place myself and how to think of it. So after the Gulf War, I stopped everything. I said, maybe I should just find another profession. And I'll have to say that documentary had always been something I wanted to do. And for me, it provided that link between not really current affairs, but to understand where the origins of what the current affairs was all about. And then I guess the flash came when I saw this documentary by Brooke Lapping called Death of a Nation on Yugoslavia. And I just said, well, for once, I'd been covering bits and bobs and everybody was getting very confused. And there was this one documentary for like 4 or 5 hours that actually, at the end of 4 or 5 hours, you could read the newspapers and actually understand what was going on and decide for yourself what it was you wanted to believe or where it was you wanted to situate yourself. So I basically decided to call them and say, hello, can I be your coffee boy? I'll be anything you want me to be, but I want to learn how you do this. I'm entirely and purely African. And I guess that categorical decision also was during that same period. I had this massive identity crisis, and I had to sort out in my own head, am I just an Egyptian? Am I an Arab? Am I a Muslim? Like, where does all this belong? And I basically decided, and I'm primarily an Egyptian, but as an Egyptian, our place is in Africa, our natural depth is Africa, and that's where we had always been turned to. I mean, when Nasser did his revolution, Nasser being the first Egyptian to ever rule Egypt, he did the natural thing and turned towards Africa. And then Sadat came and the whole country shifted back towards, looking the other way. So I'm an African and an Egyptian. Yes, I have part of an Arab identity, and yes, I'm part Muslim, I'm part everything, I guess. But what I feel as an individual and what concerns me most is my continent, and my continent is Africa. My relationship with Egypt it's always been my dreamland in a way, because my father was a diplomat, so I grew up all over the place, but I've always been an Egyptian. And so, that's the main anchor. And going back to Egypt was the biggest and most important thing for me, okay? As a filmmaker, quite early on, actually, towards the end of my journalistic career, I got into trouble and I was more or less banned from Egypt. I was banned for a few years from going into Egypt, and then after that I could go, more or less, but I was not allowed to work in Egypt. So I've never really been part of the Egyptian experience from the inside, but everything I do more or less turns around. I mean, that's why I have stories all over the world, but part of it is trying to understand my own country, to grapple with my own country and my own history. But the film industry in Egypt is quite, it's very varied. I mean, it's the oldest cinema on the continent, and if you watch the films of the 40s and the 50s, and then the way they start changing in the 70s, and sort of like the Egyptian cinema became Nollywood before Nollywood ever started, you know. But around this institutionalized Egyptian cinema, there are lots of independents that come up, and then somehow the independents haven't survived in the Egyptian context. Somehow they get sucked into the system unless they're in the diaspora. I'd written something not just critical, but documented about Mubarak's sons. And I got into trouble. Actually, the trouble was not just for me. My father, who was working at the time with the presidency, was like overnight put aside and told very clearly that I shouldn't come back, and that to transmit the message that the censorship in Egypt was not that tight. It's actually quite a perverse system where they let people talk, but only talk enough to claim that, oh, you see, there is criticism and we allow it. But there's this red line beyond which no one can go. And I think what's quite subversive about this is that it became a thing of auto-censorship. People can go that far, but they can't go anywhere beyond that. It has affected Egyptian cinema quite dramatically, because people who really started off by being quite critical and being quite it's not just about criticizing, it's about trying to understand what's going on and having a dialogue with the authorities, if you want. Little by little, they realized that they can't do it, so they became co-opted into the system. And started, like, I have a couple of names in mind. Well, I'll actually give you someone who worked in Britain, someone like Khaled Hagar. His first film was banned in Egypt. It was actually, it got a prize here in FESPACO. And his first film was banned in Egypt. He was demonized totally. And then he wanted to go back to Egypt, so he did lighter films. And now he's part of the, I mean, they're good films, but they're different kind of films. They're mostly song and dance and proximity films, like what is happening in your street rather than... and he made that shift, and a lot of people make that shift. It's quite a story, actually, quite a frustrating one, but I was on the second day of the events. I picked up the phone, I called my dad, I said, I'm coming. I mean, and he said, I beg you, we don't know if he's going or not going yet, so just stay put. Fine, so I was in Johannesburg, and then I had to go to Equatorial Guinea, which is the only Spanish colony on the continent, and a country that is more or less in the same situation. But it was shocking because the level of apathy was absolutely amazing. And I was, every evening, I was sitting in this cafe watching the events in Spanish, all alone. So it was like one of these surreal, it's like, this is the most important thing that's happening in my life. And I'm sitting in Equatorial Guinea watching Mubarak's speech in Spanish. So, I mean, like, I really wanted to be part of this. But in a funny way, it's better that I wasn't, because I'm finally going to make my first film about Egypt. I've started doing the research. And I think that if I was there, it would have been colored by my own experience and what I felt and where I was in Tahrir Square. And I guess the frustration of not being there is going to lead me to sort of piecing it together in a different kind of a way. I sort of given up on ever making an Egyptian film, and mentally, in a way, even when the events were happening, I didn't once think that I was going to make a film. And it was quite a weird process, because even when the revolt succeeded, let's say, it didn't immediately occur to me that, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And one night I couldn't sleep, and I was on the internet trying to follow it, and the specific idea and I was like, well, I can do this now. I mean, we'll see what happens if I try to do it. But mentally speaking, they had freed me too, really. I think, of course, now that the opportunity for change is amazing, everyone's very excited, and the euphoria. I mean, I can't even start telling you how I felt when the 18 days of just waiting what's going to happen. I really felt my destiny was at stake there. But I would wait and see what happens. I mean, I think the euphoria is great, but is that going to liberate us the way we've been talking? I really doubt it. I doubt it. But whatever happens, what happened, the people's uprising is the end of a chapter. Whatever happens next is a new chapter. So, and I think breaking that barrier of fear will obviously liberate film. I mean, how can you make the same kind of films when a whole population has taken the decision into their own hands? You can no longer do this to us. We have a say in our destiny, and I think this is going to be reflected in film. And obviously documentary has managed more so than feature films to say some of these things, but there is no tradition of documentary in Egypt. There's no tradition of documentary in the Arab world, and it's just about starting on the African continent. So documentary really is something that I want to continue working on. We've always seen ourselves as Africans through Western eyes. Most of the documentaries made and most of the reference documentaries are made by Europeans. There's this feeling that I haven't said my part. This isn't exactly how I'm seeing it. I mean, I'll tell you something really, basic. The filter used to film a black person visually is not the same when filmed by a European or not. I mean, there are little things like that. And I think that over the past, let's say, 10 years, there's been an interest in documentary. For a long time, documentary has been the springboard to your next feature film. But finally, in the past few years, the recognition that documentary is a different form of expression, and actually a form of expression that leaves a historic legacy of who we are and how we see the world. That's been catching on. So you are seeing a new generation of documentary filmmakers who want to be documentary filmmakers, who aren't just making a film because they can't make a feature film yet. And I think that's really important. And it's really also important in terms of how we see ourselves, what stories we choose. You have Senegalese documentary filmmakers that are making amazing and very creative documentaries from Benin, from Ghana, Yeah, I mean, it really is all over the continent, even from North Africa. In FESPACO this year, there's an Egyptian documentary filmmaker. I mean, it's very rare to have an Egyptian documentary filmmaker. Of course, they've been around, they're one here and there, but we haven't yet built that tradition of documentary filmmaking. Senegal, I guess, is one of the ones that has the largest number and are really starting to build a tradition. I think there's a huge development in the number and the kind and the way women have been developing in African cinema. And I mean, we have to put this in context. When Safi Faye did her first film, I remember she told me once, like, how she got into film and the whole problem of having a baby. She said, I strapped the baby on my back and got on with it. And that's exactly what I did with my first child. I strapped it on my back and got on with it. And I think that this recognition that film is a job, it's a profession, it's not just a luxury pastime, means that more women are doing this professionally. They're not just dabbling a little bit in film while they have some time. And so there is an emergence of a real female voice and a female cinema. I think that it's there. And I don't think it's that new. I mean, Safi Faye was working with Samben Osman. You know, she is so African cinema is new. I mean, the 40-odd years, yeah, I mean, women caught on slightly later, but it's there. I don't actually like this. Because I feel that African cinema is a ghetto. I mean, like, nobody walks around saying Spanish cinema or French cinema or whatever. It's cinema. But when it comes to Africa, it's like we're in this ghetto. Oh, label African filmmaker. So imagine being labeled African filmmaker and yet another ghetto, female African filmmaker. I'm a filmmaker. And I think there are a lot of women who are filmmakers. And I think the real problem is a financing one. It's because we still have massive issues about how we're going to do our next film, where we're going to get the money from. So you're put in that ghetto because you have to be in that ghetto to get the financing for your next film. But I don't think we need to accept this mentally and be part of that ghetto. Okay, I mean, we might have to do it, but it doesn't mean that that's how we need to think. At least that's not how I am thinking or will think. I think it's slightly more perverse than that. It's a whole economy out there. I don't know if anyone has actually sat down to count the number of African film festivals there are in Europe. It's a whole economy. All these festivals are funded, and it's the label African Film Festival that gives it its identity and its access to the funds. I'm not accusing any one of them that they got into it for the funds, but they're African film lovers who then realize that, oh, the label African film will open the door to the European Union fund for God knows what, and then the French Ministry of Cooperation fund, and the Spanish this and that. So there's a lot of money out there. And in a funny way, the money is always channeled to showcasing us, but and I'd like someone to actually go check it out, because I did do a bit of research on that. The production phase, for us to make our films, is not part of any financing or any fund. So it's either the pre-production or the post-production or the showcasing. But to actually have any help, it's not there. Not that I want it, though, huh? I actually think that I've never had financing from any one of these funds out of principle until today. I'm not saying that I'll never get it. You never know what happens. But this being assisted has had very, very perverse effects on African cinema. One, there's no obligation of quality. If you get the money from the French foreign minister to make your film, if it gets out there or not, c'est pas grave, okay? And that has meant that there is no rigor in terms of who are you competing against. It becomes part of this pool of the French. So being assisted has not helped us. So breaking that cycle or finding a different formula, if we really, if all these institutions really want to help the development of African cinema, they know that's not the way to do it. Not only bypassing a local audience, it's had many perverse effects. We're not making films for the audience because we've become so removed from the audience. And, okay, cinema is an elitist thing, okay? And going through the French system, what is underlined is that conceptual, elitist, inaccessible. And that's why Nollywood became such a big thing. Suddenly you had part of the continent saying, you know what? I want them right here to watch my films. And that's why Egypt is also a different scenario. Egypt has a local audience. Egypt has an industry that is self-sufficient. You don't need to go find funds somewhere else. You don't need to find your audience somewhere else. There is an industry that is self-sufficient, and it caters to its audience and thus raises money from its audience. But the rest of the, let's say, Francophone, mainly Francophone cinema, it became an exercise of intellectual, conceptual vision of the future, which is a good thing. I'm not against it. I'm probably part of it. But in what way are we talking to the people that should be watching our films? I'm not sure that we're that accessible. But secondly, they don't see us. Where do they see us? How can I show my films if it's not in FESPACO and if it's not in one of the African film festivals? I can't even find my own films. I can't get copies of my own films. So what happens? Piracy. Why not? So, I mean, there's a real problem with the entire system. And so unless something breaks quite radically, we're going to stay in that vicious circle going round and round and round. And I think new technology has shown us that there's a new way of doing this. There's another way of doing this. Putting your stuff out on online means that there's a whole new generation of African filmmakers that we don't even know about. They're coming out through different channels. And okay, maybe one day they're going to land in what you call the mainstream, if you want. But I think it's amazing that I do a lot of workshops, and I have this new flip camera with one button, which for me is, it reduces everything we can say down to its basic. Here you are, you can press one button and get something that is good quality. So what is filmmaking really about? The filmmaking is about the story you want to tell and how you want to tell it. So all this thing about financing, it sort of breaks down all these arguments. Because financing, you don't need financing. There's your camera, press the button, download it directly onto the thing, you have your film. Distribution, it's right out there. So I think new technology is obliging us to rethink not just what African film's about, what is film about? Is everyone who presses that button a filmmaker?